You probably will have to order a float, if not an Uber. And clearly those of you on Teams have made a sensible choice, but I'm really pleased to be here. And what I'd like to do is share with you some of my current thoughts on poor reading, which is an area that I've worked on for 50 years, believe it or not. I forgot this is being recorded, so I should not have said that probably. What I'm going to talk about is language. Everyone in this room knows more about language than I do. I'm going to talk about literacy. And I'm just going to remind us that learning to read requires us to map a written language system onto a spoken language or a language system, not necessarily spoken, at both the phonological and the semantic levels. And then I'm also going to talk about dyslexia, which again, I'm sure everyone in this room knows about and probably knows someone with dyslexia. So just to start off with brass tacks, as we say, the simple view of reading, which is very well known. According to the simple view of reading, reading comprehension depends upon the product of decoding and language comprehension. If you can't decode, you couldn't understand what you're reading. And if you could decode, but you had no language, you wouldn't be able to appreciate the text. And underpinning these two components of the simple view are underpinning decoding or phonologically based skills and what we call coding skills, letter knowledge, and obviously language comprehension, as its name implies, depends upon language skills. Now, this framework has really been widely adopted by the national curriculum, as I'm sure you know, ever since Jim Rose's review of the teaching of reading back in about 2005. It was also used to think about dyslexia, and according to Jim Rose's review of dyslexia is a difficulty primarily in these phonological skills, the domain that underpins decoding. It was it's now an old idea. This paper, written in 2004, was after 40 years of research suggesting that the core deficit in dyslexia is a phonological deficit. And I should say, mea culpa, I've been one of the people who promoted that kind of view. But recently, we've been having a bit of a rethink, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this new, it's not really a new idea, but this new model, reading is language model. And the reason we came up with this model was following a review of interventions for reading and language development. And the idea here is that language is really at the heart of literacy. It's actually at the heart of education. I'm sure you would all agree with that. And language is like an ocean. It underpins everything that we do in education. And in that ocean, there are waves, and the waves come and go. And when they reach some kind of asymptote, the ocean is ready to move to another stage. And what we think is that language skills have to be developed sufficiently to then develop the alphabetic skills, which are those code-based and phonological skills that underpin decoding. And then once decoding reaches a certain level, child's word reading really takes off and the child becomes a fluent reader. And then we have the last wave being reading comprehension. Now, it's not that once there's a wave, everything else, that component finishes. Clearly, the waves keep coming and these different aspects of reading continue to develop. But the point, I suppose, that we like to make is that language is the foundation of learning to read. And hey ho, it's not really a very new idea. And I can take you back to this book, which was written in the 1920s by Samuel Orton, who was a pediatric neurologist, had a clinic in Boston Children's Hospital, and there he was seeing a lot of children with reading difficulties and other reading-related and language problems. He was very interested in dyslexia, which he called strephosymbolia, because he thought twisting symbols was an important characteristic of it, and we now don't think that is the case. But he made some important observations. The first was that dyslexia runs in families, and certainly most of us would agree that that is the case. But he also said something a little bit more nuanced than that. It's not that dyslexia is passed down in a sort of straight line from parents to children. Rather, if there is a history of dyslexia in the family, the next generation may show a reading problem, or they may show some other kind of problem with speech or language or writing. So there was a kind of more diffuse heritability here from a reading disability to other reading related disorders, what I guess we would now call neurodevelopmental disorders. And he also, and I think this has very much been forgotten, said reading and writing problems are caused by difficulties in the development of the language faculty. And this has become my new motto. Rather than thinking of dyslexia as a very specific phonological deficit, one should start to think about it as a problem with language processing more generally. Well, obviously, Orton was working in a clinic. He was seeing children who were referred, often with very severe reading and spelling problems, and it might well be that the problems that he was seeing did not generalize. One methodology which has been used now quite extensively to look at the family patterns and inheritance of dyslexia is the family risk study. The first one was conducted in 1990 by Hollis Scarborough, and since then there have been some 30-odd studies. What happens in a family risk study is that you recruit children in the preschool years before reading instruction who are either at family risk of dyslexia because they have a parent with a problem or are free of those problems, so they're at low risk, and you then follow them through usually till around about year 2 or age 8, and at that point you assess the children and you can then identify those that develop a dyslexic problem, those family risk children who don't, and also obviously you use the control group as a benchmark. So that's the sort of paradigm used in family risk studies. And what you can do once you've identified the kids who are dyslexic at age 8, you can go backwards and try to understand the precursors of dyslexia and the developmental pathway that those children have followed. So Monica Melby-Lervag and I conducted a meta-analysis of family risk studies now back in 2016, and actually we're just in the process of updating it. At the time, the studies that were published were from right across the orthographic spectrum, from the very highly regular Finnish language through Dutch, Danish and English, which are quite irregular, and Chinese, which is a very different, a non-alphabetic writing system. And I suppose one thing that as linguists you're probably interested in is that actually the manifestation of the difficulties was very similar in the different orthographies, with phonological processing problems being a particularly universal characteristic. What this slide shows is just the prevalence of dyslexia in the offspring of children who have a dyslexic parent. And you can see there's some variability across the different studies, but overall the prevalence was 45%. So that's very high. And in this meta-analysis, 12% of the low-risk children went on to have a reading problem. So it's like a fourfold risk of developing a reading problem if you have a parent who has a reading problem. I think that's possibly a slightly high prevalence rate, which I'll come on to later, but for any family with a dyslexic parent, it sort of means that 1 in 2 of their children is going to have similar difficulties. So the other thing I said you could do is you can look backwards and you can compare children who are dyslexic, who become dyslexic, with children who are not dyslexic. And is there a pointer, or maybe not? Perhaps I can. We don't have. Okay. So in the across these family risk studies, 45% of the children followed from risk families became dyslexic, and that meant, of course, 55% didn't reach the threshold for dyslexia. And what you can do is you can look at the effect size of the dyslexic deficit when they are identified. So this is actually the deficit relative to the typically developing control group in preschool skills that include vocabulary, grammar, non-word repetition, phoneme awareness, and naming. So those last two are clearly the sorts of deficits that we see in school-age children with dyslexia, but the other deficits are really more in the language domain, vocabulary, grammar, and the ability to repeat non-words. And what you can see is these effect sizes are large. So, I mean, the smallest is for grammar, 0.72, and for non-word repetition, this is a really very big deficit. So, what we can see here, and when I did my first family risk study, which was quite a long time ago now, I think in 2001 or 2003 we published it. When we found all these language difficulties in the preschool children, I just didn't really believe the data because I was looking for selective phonological problems, but here are all these other language problems that were present. You can also compare children who are dyslexic at age 8 with children who are not dyslexic and look at the difference in the pathway. And this is quite an interesting finding because what you find is that in children with familial dyslexia, you tend to have phonological difficulties. But if the child's got good language, they can compensate for that and they seem to go on to be typically reading. Whereas if they've got the phonological deficit and they've got a language problem, then they're more likely to become dyslexic. Okay, so that's really data from a meta-analysis. What about data from a longitudinal study? So given the results of our meta-analysis, the obvious next step was to conduct a longitudinal study, which would include not just children at family risk of dyslexia, but also, by way of comparison, children who in the preschool years had a sort of selective language difficulties. At the time, we talked about specific language impairment, and now we talk about DLD, developmental language disorder. So we recruited 3 groups of children at family risk of dyslexia, children with DLD in preschool who were referred by speech and language therapists who were, because of poor language, we were not primarily interested in children with speech difficulties. We wanted it to be poor language, and also controls who we can regard as being at low risk of reading disorder. And we followed those kids initially for over 5 years, from 3.5 when they were recruited through to 8, seeing them at annual intervals. And we also did a follow-up the following year. And what we did, and just pointing on the phases here, you can see that for most children in England, school entry comes somewhere between phase 2 and phase 3 of our study, so between 4.5 and 5.5 years. And when the children were 8, we assessed them and we defined dyslexia using a very much a working definition as being children who fell 1 standard deviation below average. Yeah. Okay, so just to cut straight to the chase, here are the data from that study in terms of the proportion of children in the different groups who go on to be dyslexic. So on the left of the slide, you have data from children who are typically developing in terms of their language in preschool. And on the right of the slide, children who had this language disorder in preschool. And then we've got grey is not at family risk and green is at family risk. So if we start up looking at the typical language children, you see 7% of those children go on to have a reading difficulty. That's pretty much spot on what population estimates suggest. If they're at family risk here, they've got a 26% probability that they will be dyslexic. So again, it's about a 4-fold increase in the risk of dyslexia in children with typically developing language in preschool. But if you look at children who've got language disorder in preschool, you'll see that 26% of them go on to have a reading problem. But if they have both DLD and they're at family risk, it's 40%, which is very much higher. And this is is indicative of what we might call additive risks. There are two risks going on here. There's the family risk and there's the language risk. And when these two things come together, you get a very high likelihood that a child will have a reading problem. Okay, another way of looking at it is in these scatter plots, which I shall try and describe. So we've got here three groups of children, three risk groups. We've got the typical group, the family risk group, and the group with developmental language disorder in preschool. And these are data taken from the 3.5 and the 4.5 year assessments. I think of the word. The crossbars. So on the x-axis, you've got phonological skills. They're measured by non-word repetition, and on the y-axis, you've got measure of language. And we're interested in, almost like the simple view of reading, how these two sets of skills intersect. The horizontal line is the line which is one standard deviation below average in language, and the vertical lines, if you're on the left of the vertical line, you're one standard deviation below average in phonological skills. So in the typical group, and I should emphasize, we weren't selecting children for phonology, we were only selecting for language. In the typical group, if you look at where they are, they're in that upper right quadrant, which indicates they've got good phonological skills and they've got good language skills. If you look at children at family risk, you can see a different pattern here. So quite a lot of them are in that upper right quadrant, but there's also quite a scattering in the left of the vertical line, suggesting that quite a few of them have got phonological difficulties. Thank you.
Oh, I think if you've got your, it might be full.
I'm doing it off there.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Okay.
I can actually walk along as long as it doesn't affect the.
No, it's fine.
And then for the developmental language disorder, well, a lot of them are below this line, and you'd expect that because they're kind of identified as having a language disorder. But I want to point out, of course, along with that language disorder, a lot of them are to the left of that poor phonology line, so they've also got phonological difficulties. So again, if you're thinking about risk factors, you might say these kids are at risk, they've got poor phonology, and these kids are at risk because they've got poor phonology and they've got poor language. It's again the idea of additive risk. And just to remind you of the prevalence that we found in the study, 7% of typical children had a reading problem. This was sort of 5 years later than these data were plotted. 26% of family risk and 66% altogether with DLD. Okay, so we're talking here about, of course, a spectrum of reading disorders, and I'm sure you've seen this kind of diagram before. This is based around the idea of the simple view of reading. Dorothy Bishop and I published a similar way of thinking about actually DLD many years ago now. But what I want to point out here is that there's two sorts of dyslexia here. There are children who are the classic dyslexic child. So these are children who are bright in every area, but have got poor reading. So they've got good language and they've got poor phonology. They're the ones who would take part in all of our experiments for many, many years. And they were diagnosed using the discrepancy definition of dyslexia, that being that a child with dyslexia has poor reading relative to their age and IQ. Now, of course, that discrepancy definition is no longer used, although it does still creep up in ICD-11. But the point is, on the left are children with dyslexia who've got poor phonology, but they've also got poor language. And I think that in our schools and in our clinics and in our studies, we are not necessarily noticing the language difficulties of these children here. They probably might get a reading diagnosis, but they probably have got underlying language weaknesses that are not being identified and not being attended to. And that may also be why they have very persistent forms of reading impairment. So just to sort of press that home a little bit further, is some more strange graphs which are plotting deficits. So these are bar charts. The higher the bar, the bigger the deficit in a group relative to controls. And what we've got here in the purple are children who go on to be dyslexic, in the green, children who've got dyslexia and DLD, that other pattern. And we've got them from 4.5, 5.5 to about 6.5. And if you look at phoneme awareness, first of all, so this is the classic dyslexic side. You can see that the dyslexic children have got a effect size deficit of 1 big, already at 4.5, 5.5 is bigger than 6.5. And the DLD children also have these phonemic deficits, and they're larger than the dyslexic deficits. When you look at language, you see this different pattern, again, reinforcing that these are separable risk factors. The language disordered children have got very big language problems. The dyslexic children have got no language problem here. That's how they were, they were not selected for having language problems. 5.5, their language isn't good, but they're still in the normal range. But actually, rather interestingly, by 6.5, many of those children do seem to be having language difficulties, and I can't say I really understand that pattern. Okay, so what's next? Okay, so what we've got to try and understand is how is language impacting reading? Because here we're not talking about reading comprehension. So we know that language is important for reading comprehension. But when we're talking about dyslexia, we're talking about children who've got decoding deficits primarily. And so how do we explain the fact that language is a significant risk factor for that population? Well, we can look at that using some of our longitudinal data, and this is a highly simplified version of some of the tasks that we had in our longitudinal study. In fact, we had the same tasks at every age, but I've just put on a few to illustrate. So when we recruited, we had a broad range of language tasks. I'm sure you'll be familiar with some of these. On the KELF, basic concepts, expressive vocabulary and sentence structure, and we also had a morpheme generation task, the table generating past tense and third person singular. And then most of those tasks stayed constant over time, although some obviously went feeling like this is greener. And then from 4.5, we were measuring phoneme awareness, letter knowledge, and rapid naming, being what we often refer to as the triple foundation of reading. And then we started measuring reading and spelling every time point from here, actually. But we could only start measuring reading comprehension at age of 8. Now, I'll just show briefly this horrible structural equation model of those developmental relationships. And there's a few points I'd want to make. The first is, remember, we were measuring language at the beginning, and we were also measuring some what I thought of as phonological processing measures like non-word repetition, articulation, word repetition. But in the structural equation model, all of our language measures, including those measures, loaded on a single unitary latent factor, which we call language. There was some residual variance for the ones that involved more sort of phonological processing, and that loaded on the second factor, which we call speech. But after that, speech didn't really have any impact further down the line on reading development. What happened for language was we then looked to see how it predicted the precursors of reading and then word reading itself. And what you can see is that language at age 4.5 predicts this triple foundation for reading, phoneme awareness, letter knowledge, and rapid naming. And if you could see this, the path to phoneme awareness is particularly strong. It's 0.7. And then between 4.5 and actually 5.5 and also 6.5, I haven't got it on here, there are two predictors of word reading accuracy: letter sound knowledge and phoneme awareness, which is what we typically think of as the alphabetic foundation of reading. And if you don't like those diagrams, here's a much nicer, prettier version. What we're saying is that language at 3 predicts the triple foundation of reading, which predicts word reading and then also reading and spelling. And the important point is the impact of language on word reading isn't direct at all. It's mediated by phoneme awareness and letter knowledge. And that pathway from language to phoneme awareness is particularly strong. So it's really a crucial foundation for the skills that we know are involved in learning to essentially decode, or sometimes called phonics. So just to summarize what I've said so far, well, actually in population samples, 7 to 10% of children have reading difficulties. In our study, we found 7%, but we found two different sorts of pathways to poor reading. That was children with a history of reading difficulties developed significant reading problems, and children with preschool language difficulties also had problems learning to read. And our statistical modelling suggests that the impact of poor language on poor reading is mediated by poor phoneme awareness. Another way of saying that, that there is a mediation between language and phoneme and learning to read, and that's the mediator is phoneme awareness. But as I said earlier, there's also this rather strange finding that some children who have good language have poor phoneme awareness. So the way I like to think of it, this is the same model that you've just seen, but just put slightly differently, with language as the foundation of the alphabetic skills that go on to underpin reading. And we've got two risks for dyslexia. We've got poor language and we've got poor phonological skills, and also good language provides a resilience. So if a child's phonological problems are not too severe, I'd say, and I haven't actually looked at it in any detail, the levels that good language can compensate for poor phonology. Not really allowed in phonics regimes, however. Okay, so what about speech? Our study wasn't set up to look at speech at all, but some of the children that we saw did actually have speech problems, including some children in the low risk group. In fact, I think 68 had, 68 had speech difficulties at 3.5, as indicated by scoring 2 standard deviations below average on the test of articulation naming. So we selected from the low risk group 68 children who were similar in gender, nonverbal ability, social class, to compare with the children who had the speech difficulties. And of course, it was quite a complicated scattering of speech difficulties in our sample. So we had 13 children who only had a speech difficulty. So these were in the low risk group. They didn't have a family risk or they didn't have language problems. 16 also had family risk. 22 had language impairment, and 17 had family risk and language impairment. So, I mean, we were very interested to know, this is small scale stuff, what their reading and spelling outcomes would be like. And they're shown on this graph here. Sorry, the deficits are going the other way around now. If you look at the speech sound disorder group only, they're the sort of brownie ones, the confidence interval there goes across 0, which means they're not significantly different from typically developing children. So by age 8, they're not showing reading or spelling problems. I should say they do show a bit of a slow to get going with phoneme awareness, but they don't have a problem by the time they're 8. If they also have family risk of dyslexia, they do have more a significant problem in reading and spelling at age 8. And if they've got a language impairment, the difficulties are much more severe. So it's the children with language difficulties, with or without family risk, who are really have problems with speech problems, who really have those difficulties. Well, that's a very small sample. So I've also just put here some data from Charles Hume's bigger study of a representative sample of 600 children in Brisbane area of Australia, looking at speech, language and nonverbal ability as predictors of word reading. And here they measured speech at 2 points in time. So this speech factor is actually a measure of the persistence of a speech difficulty. And what you can see from this, if you can remember the previous structural equation model, is we've got a similar mediation of language's impact on reading via phoneme awareness and letter knowledge, and not rapid naming. But also here, when you're looking at persistence, children with persistent speech difficulties also are vulnerable to reading problems, but again, mediated by phoneme awareness, which is consistent with the data from our study. But clearly, the risk factors are not just some articulation difficulty. It's if there's a persistent speech difficulty, it's school entry or poor language. These are risk factors for learning to read, and their impact is mediated by phoneme awareness. So where have we got to now? So I hope by now I'm convincing you that early language is the foundation for learning to read. Its impact is mediated by phoneme awareness and letter knowledge in an alphabetic system. Speech difficulties carry a relatively lower risk than language difficulties, but a great risk if they're combined with either persistence or poor language. And then on the other side of the coin, good language promotes phoneme awareness and emergent reading skills. And also, I think, and I'm not showing the data from the particular age groups, but I think school age is a critical time window. So children who come to school, so some variability in language development, and some children with poor language at 3.5 actually resolve their problems. And if they've resolved their problems, they tend to have a quite good reading outcome. So school entry is a critical window. Okay, what about reading comprehension? Well, you know what's going to happen here. We know that word reading is a critical component of reading comprehension. And what we show here is that very early language also has an impact on reading comprehension. And that's direct, it's not mediated. It's essentially mediated by itself. So language predicts language, predicts language, predicts language. It's actually a highly stable construct. Okay, so just one more thing on reading comprehension. We've looked at these two profiles of dyslexia. I'm sure you know there's another group of children with reading comprehension problems who actually learn to read or to decode well. They learn phonics all right. We can think about, well, how do those three reading impaired children look in terms of their reading comprehension relative to typically developing children? And here's the level of the comprehension difficulty. And this is, I think, quite interesting because, again, we see an additive pattern. So for children who become dyslexic, their reading comprehension is poor. It's weak, but it's not really terribly impaired. It's for some of them, but many of them kind of manage all right in reading comprehension. The children with DLD only have got significant language reading comprehension problems. But again, if you've got both deficits, you've got a very big problem. So again, we're thinking here about different sorts of risk factors combining. And of course, it's not a very new idea. Bruce Pennington and Dorothy Bishop wrote an important review article in 2009, which really picked up on Bruce Pennington's earlier work, that we need to think about dyslexia as being the outcome of multiple deficits, not just a single phonological deficit, but other deficits will add in and accumulate. And what Bishop and Pennington said was that if you look at children with reading, language and speech disorders, there are some similarities and there are some differences, but those who go on to actually have significant reading problems are those where there are phonological impairments. So this is the way that I have tended to think about it. This is a kind of idea that you can think about explanations at 3 different levels. The biological level, where we get the genes and the brains, the neural substrate for, in this case, learning to read. The behavioral level, which is whether or not you're a good reader. And in between those 2 levels is cognition. The cognitive level of explanation mediates between the brain and behavior. And in dyslexia, at this cognitive level, is this core phonological deficit. And even everything that I've said today is still consistent with the idea that at the core is a phonological deficit. And that can lead to dyslexia. But the point I'd want to make is that there are other, sometimes called endophenotypes or risk factors, that can contribute to the problems in learning to read. And if a child has poor phonology and also poor speech or also poor language, they're more likely to reach a threshold that would get them a diagnosis of dyslexia. But essentially, it's really a multidimensional spectrum. And I want to just come back to family risk, because we tend to think of family risk as being genetic. Families share genes, but of course they also share environments. And we mustn't ever forget that at every level of explanation, we have environmental interactions. The home literacy environment is very important for, in a way, safeguarding children's reading progress and reading development. And the family literacy environment might be different in children of dyslexic parents to controls, and the 2 other very important factors which, as educators, you're very aware of, schooling and intervention. The curriculum can be really quite important in who develops a problem and whether or not they're given any kind of intervention. I think I've got time to just briefly mention comorbidities. These are in blue slides because I think we don't entirely understand it, but we were quite interested in going beyond language-related skills to look at some of the other features that often co-occur in children with these kinds of neurodiverse profiles. So a bit dark, but essentially what we're comparing here is from children at 3.5 and 4.5 pulled across. We're looking at their performance on tests of executive function, so executive attention, and fine motor skills. And we define as a deficit children who fall 1 standard deviation below average in these different domains. Children at family risk, 82% of them when in a preschool are free of other problems. So, but we've got a small number. We've got 18% have either got a motor or an executive impairment. For the children with a developmental language disorder, the level of comorbidity is much higher. 46% of those children at 3.5 and 4.5 have problems either with motor skill development or with executive function. Now, we've tried to look to see what these impairments predict, and our models are not very satisfying. The language always wins out, or phonology wins out, depending on the age in which you look. These skills tend to be correlated, of course, with language, which is what this shows. But I want to just show you the outcome data here, which is quite interesting, because these are now not children at risk. These are children who've got a problem with dyslexia or with or without language disorder. And you can see now that the level of comorbidity is much higher. So here, 52% of the children with dyslexia have got some other problem as well. And here it's, I didn't work it out, but only 59%. But they're remarkably similar. The only thing that really differs between these 2 outcome groups is the proportion of the group who have both executive and motor difficulties. And that's higher, 28% in the DLG with dyslexia, and only 14% in the children with dyslexia. But there's a remarkable commonality here, suggesting that some of these difficulties, which are identifiable earlier, actually are having an impact on learning to read. It may not be a very direct one. I don't think it is a direct one, but obviously if you can't attend well, and or if you have poor fine motor skills, there's going to be various things in a classroom you're not going to be good at, and it may impact learning to read in different sorts of ways that we still need to think about. Okay, so just returning to this idea then of language being at the heart of literacy, I want to just try and, I mean, this is very much a hypothesis at the moment, but what would we see at each? Why is language important at each of these points? So starting off with language in the ocean, I think that language of the home is really very, very important. And obviously in school systems, particularly multilingual systems, if the home language differs from the school language, this can create a problem, not least for literacy development, but for other skills too. In terms of developing code-related skills, we know that many parents actually actively teach, particularly letters. Some teach writing, and there's also a passive role of the home learning environment. So parents who read a lot, their children see them reading. Schools will have a lot of books, homes that have a lot of books. Children might bring a book to be read. So there's lots of active and passive aspects of the home learning environment that can affect the development of decoding. And then when you want to develop word reading fluency, well, first of all, you need to read a lot. So you need to practice. So print exposure is very important. And we know that children with dyslexic difficulties don't like reading. And that actually sets in very early. And they don't read nearly so much as other children outside of school. And then there's this concept of sector variability, which a lot of psychologists are working on now. And this is the idea that if you're going to decode a word, particularly if it's an irregular word, that you don't just decode it by grapheme phoneme correspondences or phonics, but you have to kind of match a partial decode to a word in your vocabulary. And that process is one which will work much better for children who have much better language and much better vocabulary. And then when we get to reading comprehension, obviously vocabulary is really important. This might be where some of those executive skills come in, because working memory is very important in reading comprehension, and executive function is strongly correlated with language. And some of the comprehension strategies that children use, like summarizing or questioning or making inferences, these are all language aspects that are impacting reading comprehension. So that's trying to flesh out the model a little bit. Obviously, lots of work to do empirically on validating it. So just to finish off, implications for education. So in the US now, there is a whole wave, a whole movement called the Science of Reading, which is trying to ensure evidence-based practice in schools. I have to say their main interpretation of the science of reading is the need to teach phonics and not whole language. So they seem in that regard to be a little bit behind us. And clearly the science of reading is much more than just about teaching phonics. What I've been saying is that in a way, a simple view of reading is a bit too simple, because absolutely agree that letter knowledge and phonological awareness are the predictors of decoding, and decoding and reading comprehension come together. So decoding impacts reading comprehension in combination with language. But I think that kind of model forces people to think, first of all, we teach phonics and then we teach about context and language. And actually, we really need to remember that language is at the foundation, because its impact on reading is mediated by letter knowledge and phonological awareness. So we've seen that before. There are two risks for poor reading, poor language and poor reading. And I think we need to be doing interventions in both of those domains. I think you'll know about this, which is a study that was carried out in this department. showing that it's screening for early language at school entry and then intervening with children who have poor language is effective, and furthermore it can be delivered at scale. The English government has funded a rollout of our language intervention, which is the Nelly programme, which is a 20-week teaching assistant delivered programme with 3 themes really aimed at improving children's vocabulary, narrative and language comprehension. And in the second 10 weeks also working on their letter knowledge and phonological awareness, although of course there's lots of that going on in school as well. We've run several trials showing efficacy. What you might not know is we've recently done a follow-up of children who received the Nelly programme 2 years after it finished. Now, typically, as you know, these kind of interventions fade out over time, and we were, in a way, pessimistic about what we would find. But what we found was that 2 years after the Nelly intervention, there were continuing improvements in language, but also at this point, those improvements were also seen in reading and reading comprehension. So the effect sizes are there. Effect size from languages 0.33, reading comprehension 0.24, and word reading 0.22. So we're really pleased and a little surprised by those results, but they reinforce the idea, I think, that reading is language. What about children who have difficulties with phonological skills? Well, we know a lot about how to help children who've got decoding difficulties. There's a massive literature on reading interventions, and we can think about them as combining work on phoneme awareness, letter knowledge in the context of reading, and at more advanced levels, links between the letters or the letter clusters and the morphemes of words. For children with poor comprehenders, they tend to need quite a lot of work on inferencing and story structure. Obviously, the DLD group need both, and we all need to practice reading, and reading practice is something that is very much, I think, part now of the reading curriculum. If you don't attend to children's reading difficulties, they will disengage from reading, they'll read less, and then, of course, the difficulties will be magnified over time. So just to finish then, evidence-based intervention are effective for children with reading and language difficulties. Educators need to ensure the foundations of language are in place to safeguard the development of decoding as well as comprehension skills. And also just to say that none of this is a quick fix. Language learning impairments are lifelong, and many do require ongoing support to develop reading and reading comprehension skills. I just want to go back to a moment to the environment, particularly the impact of social disadvantage on language. And I don't need to tell anyone in this room this, but these are data from our language screening tool. About 500,000 children in here or something, but their performance on language screening is plotted according to the percentage of free school meals in their school. So this is at the school level, from very few free school meals to high numbers of school meals. And the score, there's almost a linear decrease in language skills as you go down that social spectrum, something like 10 standard score points, which is really extraordinary. So we need to ensure, I think, that at school entry that we are identifying children with language learning difficulties, and we are providing evidence-based interventions to support them. And children with developmental language disorder are particularly at high risk, and I think we should be preparing them for school entry well, and then at school entry continuing to support them. And if we don't, we are reinforcing these cycles of disadvantage. Children with poor language and literacy grow up to be adults with poor qualifications. They end up with poor home resources, and then they end up passing on to their kids poor quality of education in various ways. So we don't want to be doing that. And thank you for listening.